At the threshold of 60, one stands not at the end of the road, but at the doorway of an entirely different path. The ambitions and pursuits that once seemed vital begin to loosen their hold, and something quieter, yet infinitely more compelling, calls from within. It is not the world that changes, but the soul itself turning from the outer climb toward the inner descent, from the quest to be someone to the journey of becoming oneself. We are not meant to spend our final decades repeating the first. What once was a hunger for achievement becomes a hunger for meaning. In this second half of life, the soul demands honesty, depth, and the courage to face what has been left unexamined at around 60. There comes a moment when life begins to ask a question you have never truly heard before, or perhaps you heard it in faint whispers in earlier years, but were too busy chasing the outer world to pay attention, a question that cannot be answered by your job title, your possessions, or even your accomplishments, a question that cuts deeper than your reputation and the image you have built in the eyes of others, a question that rises not from society's demands, but from the quiet depths of your own being. And that question is no longer, what will you make of yourself? As it might have been in youth, it is no longer concerned with proving your worth or climbing higher in the structures of ambition. Instead, it insists with unshakable force, who are you beyond all that you have made? And when it arrives, you feel it not as an abstract thought, but as a shift in the very center of your life, a turning of the inner compass, as though the soul, which had been patiently waiting while you played your necessary roles, now steps forward into the light and claims its place at the front. And it does so with a quiet authority that cannot be argued with, because this is not about external validation anymore. This is about truth, and truth does not bargain or flatter. It simply waits until you are ready to face it, and now you are ready because 60 is not the age of frantic construction but of deliberate excavation. It is when the scaffolding you built around yourself in earlier decades becomes less necessary, when the trophies and milestones lose some of their shine, when you begin to sense that the outer climb has served its purpose, and now the journey must turn inward, not as a withdrawal from life, but as a fuller engagement with the life that is yours beneath all the roles. You begin to realize that so much of what you thought was you was in fact armor, strategies of survival, identities shaped to fit into the expectations of family, culture, and circumstance. But the soul does not care for those masks. It calls you now to step beyond them, to ask what remains when all titles are gone, when all praise fades, when all competition ends, and what remains is the essence you were born with, the self you carried before you learned to hide it. And though at first this realization can be unsettling, even disorienting, it soon becomes a liberation, because the turning point at 60 is an invitation to live without pretense, to speak in your own voice, to walk in your own rhythm, and to value the kind of success that cannot be measured by numbers or applause, but only by the quiet conviction that you are finally aligned with what matters most. And though the world may still clamor for your attention, the soul now has your ear, and it will not lead you astray because its compass points unfailingly toward the center of who you truly are. The striving to outpace others, to be seen as exceptional in the eyes of the world, to build a name that echoes beyond your immediate circle, begins to lose its intoxicating pull as you enter this later chapter of life. And it is not because ambition dies, but because its purpose changes. You start to sense that the endless competition which once fueled your days was, in truth, a kind of apprenticeship, a proving ground where you tested your abilities, your endurance, your place in the world. But the deeper self has little interest in staying in that arena forever, because the constant measuring of yourself against others is exhausting to the soul. And at 60, the weariness is not from lack of energy, but from the recognition that this race has no real finish line, no moment of ultimate victory that will grant lasting peace. You realize that no matter how far you ran, how high you climbed, there would always be another comparison waiting, another rival to outshine, another audience to please, and you see now how much of your energy was consumed by these external contests. Yet something in you has shifted. Your gaze is no longer fixed on the horizon of others' approval, but on the inner horizon where meaning resides, and in that turning you find a freedom you could not have imagined in earlier years, the freedom to step out of the crowd without the fear of being forgotten, the freedom to slow your pace without feeling left behind, the freedom to stop proving and start living, because now you understand that the worth of a life is not in how it towers over others, but in how it stands true within itself. There is a quiet dignity in this stage, a sense of having nothing to prove and therefore nothing to hide. And while the world outside may still clamor faster, higher, louder, you are drawn to slower, deeper, quieter. You begin to savor the richness of experience rather than the currency of achievement, the moments that are felt fully rather than displayed publicly. You discover that your presence carries more weight than your performance. And this is not laziness but wisdom, because you have seen enough of life to know that the applause fades, the rankings change, the records are broken, but the inner contentment that comes from living in alignment with your true self cannot be taken away, and so you release the urge to compete for the sake of ego. You let go of the subtle envy that once crept in when others succeeded. You stop counting wins and losses and start measuring the depth of your peace. And in this new relationship with life, you are not a quitter but a graduate, leaving behind the lessons of outer competition to embrace the mastery of inner fulfillment, walking not toward the next victory, but toward the kind of stillness that is itself the greatest triumph. The years that have passed by the time you reach 60 bring with them a mirror that does not flatter and does not lie, a mirror that reflects not only the moments you are proud of, but also the parts of life you turned away from, the dreams you quietly folded and placed on a shelf, the callings you silenced because they seemed impractical or risky, the truths you swallowed to keep the peace or to fit into the life that was expected of you. And it is here in this stage that these neglected parts of yourself begin to stir, not to accuse you but to remind you that they still exist, that they have been patiently waiting for you to have the courage and the time to welcome them back. You begin to notice that the old distractions no longer keep them quiet. You cannot work longer hours or chase the next achievement to drown them out as you once did, because something in you now values authenticity over busyness. And so this reckoning arrives, sometimes softly, sometimes with a sudden force. And it is not about regret, though it may first feel like it. It is about reclaiming the unlived life, about asking yourself what pieces of your soul have been left outside the home of your daily existence, and what it would mean to invite them in at last. Perhaps it was a form of creative expression you always wanted to explore. Perhaps it was a kind of relationship you longed for but feared to pursue. Perhaps it was the choice to speak a truth you have carried in silence for decades. And now the question is not why you didn't, but whether you will still. There is a strange grace in this stage, because while youth often believes that time is infinite, here you know it is not, and yet that knowledge sharpens your attention rather than dulling it. You begin to sense that even a single day lived in alignment with your true desires has more value than years spent in denial of them. You start to understand that the unlived life is not lost life unless you refuse to claim it when it comes knocking again, and so you listen more closely to the stirrings of your heart. You take seriously the small voices within that say, now is the time. You find yourself less willing to make excuses and more willing to take risks. And even if those risks seem small to others, they are immense to you, because they represent the act of honoring what has been hidden for too long. And as you begin to weave these neglected threads back into the fabric of your days, you discover that they bring with them a vitality you thought had been lost to age. You realize that the unlived life was not just waiting for you, but holding a part of your spirit in trust until you were ready to receive it. And now, finally, you are ready. The outer climb that defines so much of the first half of life is a movement upward, a striving toward recognition, stability, and identity, and it is necessary because in those earlier years the soul must learn how to stand in the world, how to build a place to inhabit, how to gather the tools and the confidence to exist among others, but there comes a moment, often around 60, when that upward motion no longer feels like the truest direction, when the summit you thought you were climbing toward reveals itself not as the end but as a turning point. And instead of rising higher into visibility, you feel the pull to move downward into depth, not as a fall or a collapse, but as a deliberate descent into the layers beneath the surface where the truest parts of you have always been waiting. You begin to notice that the external markers of progress, titles, possessions, accolades, no longer carry the same urgency. Their ability to define you fades because something inside knows that they are only the shell, not the substance, and this descent becomes a journey toward the roots of your own being, toward the foundation that has been supporting you all along but has been hidden beneath the demands of striving. And in making this turn inward, you begin to feel a different kind of ambition, one that is not about being seen but about seeing yourself clearly, not about being admired but about being whole. You start to seek out silence where before you sought noise. You start to value stillness where before you valued movement. You begin to peel away the layers of performance and ask what remains when all the external roles are gone, and what you find is not emptiness but a fullness that had been obscured, a richness of inner life that can only be discovered by those willing to step away from the endless climb. This is not an easy shift because the habits of the first half of life are deeply ingrained. The mind will try to pull you back toward proving, competing, and accumulating. But if you listen closely, you will hear the deeper voice that calls you downward, a voice that knows your truest treasures are not above you in some imagined peak, but within you in the quiet depths. And as you follow that voice, you realize that what you once feared as a loss of momentum is in fact the beginning of wisdom, that the descent is not about giving up on life, but about entering it more completely, not as a character in a play written by others, but as the author of your own final chapters. And in this movement into depth, you find a steadiness that no summit could give you, because now you are rooted in something that cannot be taken away. And from this rootedness, you begin to see the world differently, not from above as a place to conquer, but from within as a place to understand and to be fully present in by the time 60 arrives. The masks you have worn for decades begin to loosen, not because you no longer care how you appear to others, but because you no longer feel the same compulsion to hide behind them. In youth, those masks served a purpose. They protected you from rejection. They allowed you to fit into the roles you were given. They helped you navigate the unpredictable demands of family, work, and society. But as the years pass, you begin to realize that the cost of wearing them has been high. They may have shielded you, but they also kept you from breathing fully, from speaking what you truly felt, from allowing your face and your voice to carry the unfiltered truth of who you are. And so with each passing year you feel less willing to keep up the performance. You stop pretending to agree when you do not. You stop forcing yourself into gatherings that drain you. You stop shaping your words to avoid every possible misunderstanding. Instead, you begin to speak in a tone that is clear and steady, not for the sake of provocation, but because it is exhausting to constantly translate yourself into a language that is not your own. And you find that as the masks fall away, the world around you shifts. Some people draw closer because they recognize the freedom in your authenticity, while others drift away because they were attached not to you, but to the role you played. Yet this no longer troubles you the way it once would have, because at this stage the approval of others is no longer the currency you live by. Your sense of worth begins to come from a place within that is beyond the reach of flattery or criticism. You discover that the more you allow yourself to be seen as you are, the lighter your steps become. You no longer waste energy maintaining false fronts. You begin to inhabit your own skin with a sense of ease that was elusive in earlier decades. This does not mean you become unkind or careless with others' feelings. It means you have learned that honesty can be a form of respect for yourself and for them. And the beauty of this shedding is that it makes space for real connection when you are no longer performing. Those who remain in your life are there because they value the truth of you, not the mask you once wore, and this creates a kind of intimacy and trust that cannot be forged in pretense. There is a deep relief in this freedom, a quiet joy in knowing that you have nothing to prove, nothing to disguise, nothing to manipulate into an acceptable image. You are simply living as yourself, and while this might have frightened you in earlier years, now it feels like the most natural thing in the world, as though you have finally remembered the face you had before the world told you to cover it in this turning of life. There comes a moment when you understand that purpose is no longer something you chase with the same restless urgency that once drove you. In the earlier decades, purpose was often tied to ambition, to achievement, to leaving a mark that others could see and measure. It was about building, proving, securing, but now something shifts and the hunger is different. What matters is not how far your influence reaches in the outer world, but how deeply your presence touches lives that are actually within your reach. You begin to see that true purpose is not born from the desire to be remembered, but from the desire to be real. It is not about quantity, but about quality, not about speed, but about depth. And so a new kind of service begins to emerge, one that is no longer fueled by the fear of failure or the hope of glory, but by the quiet satisfaction of doing what is right simply because it is right. You find that the most meaningful contributions are often invisible to the wider world. A conversation that leaves someone lighter, a gesture that eases another's burden, a moment of listening that allows someone to feel heard for the first time in years. And these acts, though small in appearance, carry a weight and a significance that the grand achievements of earlier life sometimes did not, because they come from a place of authenticity and not performance. The work you do now, whether in your career or in your personal life, becomes infused with this shift in intention. It is less about climbing and more about planting, less about gathering and more about giving. And this does not mean you stop striving altogether, but that your striving is now aligned with a different compass, one that points toward integrity and peace rather than status and applause. You begin to understand that the legacy you leave is not the sum of your accomplishments, but the imprint of your character, the way you treated people, the steadiness you brought, moments of uncertainty, the truth you were willing to live by even when it cost you. And with this realization there comes a lightness, a release from the constant pressure to prove yourself, because you see that the worth of your life cannot be determined by anyone outside yourself. It is measured in the quiet, in the unseen, in the way you feel when you lay your head down at night, knowing you have acted in alignment with your deeper values. And as this new purpose takes root, it brings with it a sense of calm, because you no longer need to chase every opportunity or force every outcome. You can allow life to unfold without the constant anxiety that you are missing your chance, for you have found that your chance is not a single moment but a way of being, a way of showing up in the world that is both steady and alive. And in that way you discover that the second half of life is not about doing less but about doing what matters most. 60 becomes a meeting place between the person you have been and the one you are still becoming. It is a crossing of paths where the decades you have already lived stand before you, holding all their lessons, mistakes, victories and wounds, and the decades yet to come stand quietly, waiting to be shaped by what you choose to carry forward. In youth it is easy to believe that each stage of life is separate from the others, that you can leave the past behind like an old house you no longer visit. But at this point you begin to see how every choice, every experience, every joy and every sorrow is still with you, woven into the fabric of who you are. There is no escaping them and no need to, because they are not here to bind you but to complete you. The fragments of your earlier life, the parts of yourself you once dismissed or feared, can now be brought together. You have the perspective to understand how your failures taught you resilience, how your disappointments carved out space for empathy, how your successes gave you confidence but also revealed their limitations. You begin to see the patterns that once seemed random, threads that have been weaving through your life all along. And this is where the possibility of integration begins. You are no longer just reacting to life as it comes. You are consciously shaping it, taking the wisdom of the past and using it to guide the steps of your present. This is not about rewriting your history but about making peace with it, no longer dividing yourself into the acceptable and the hidden parts, but allowing all of it to belong to you, the light and the shadow, the strength and the vulnerability, and in doing so you find a kind of wholeness that was never possible in earlier years when you were still busy proving or escaping. The person you are becoming is not someone entirely new, but the fullest expression of who you have always been, refined by time, softened by compassion, strengthened by experience, and as you stand in this place between past and future, you realize that your life is not a series of disconnected chapters, but a single unfolding story, one in which every moment has meaning even if you could not see it at the time, and this awareness brings with it a deep calm, because you no longer feel at war with your own history, you no longer feel the need to outrun certain memories or pretend they never happened. You can hold them all, not with bitterness but with acceptance, and from this acceptance comes a sense of direction, because when the past is no longer a weight you are dragging, it becomes a source of strength you can draw from. And this strength is what allows you to walk forward with clarity, knowing that the truth of who you are has been shaped by every step you have taken, and that nothing in your journey has been wasted. This is not the fading of the light, but its concentration into a steadier flame. The turning of the soul at 60 is not a retreat from life, but the beginning of living it in its truest form. The world outside may continue to rush forward, but within, time slows not in idleness, but in reverence. What lies ahead is no longer a climb toward the summit of recognition, but a walk into the sacred landscape of your own truth. And in that journey, perhaps for the first time, you are not striving to become anyone else, you are finally coming home to yourself.